So before this episode started, I just wanted to say that today is the 10th theory video on this channel! Seriously, that's like 10 times I've stayed up until like 1 in the morning just working on these. Sure, I may have not gotten as much sleep as needed and felt like hibernating the next day for a full week, but you know what? It was worth it. So today I'll be looking at my first viewer requested theory as we uncover the secrets of the Great Plateau. One of the most crucial parts of a game in my opinion is how it starts. If you are greeted with an hour-long tutorial before the actual game starts, most likely it will be a snore fest that you are forced to tank through in order to actually start having fun. Sure, a slow beginning like Twilight Princess might be annoying, but I can tell you of a more boring one. Back then, I had always wanted to try the Kingdom Hearts series and remember being in the game store. Right before my eyes were two games, Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 for the PlayStation 2. For some bizarre reason, I chose to get the second game, which, since the Kingdom Hearts story is super complicated, was probably not the smartest move. Plus, that game is unbearably slow at the start due to tutorials and other annoying things. I'm bringing this up because, unlike other games, Breath of the Wild has one of the best opening areas ever that gives you no real restraints on what to do, but still acts somewhat like a tutorial section. And that, of course, is the Great Plateau. Even months before the game's release, players have been trying to figure out the many mysteries of this area. And thanks to the Arch Noble for bringing this theory to my attention, us two along with Laurulian Historian have been looking into this question and may have finally found the answer. Now, I thought that instead of beating around the bush, I would get right to the point. Some time ago, a person that went by the user The Arch Noble posted in my Discord group a very interesting theory. He believed that the Lost Woods and Great Plateau may have swapped locations prior to the events taking place in Breath of the Wild. He provided a few pieces of information to support this claim. First of all, by examining the map, you can see that both are very similar in size. Even the shapes of them are somewhat alike. Plus, he brings up the point that the surrounding landscapes do not match with both the Plateau and the Lost Woods region, which I definitely understand. I mean, the Great Plateau specifically always seemed like it was just not supposed to be where it was found. If we moved the Great Plateau to the location of the Lost Woods, then Mount Hylia's location would make much more sense. Arch Noble also brings up how Lon Lon's ranch is in a very similar location in Breath of the Wild compared to Ocarina of Time. While we already know these two are connected somehow, it is still a very interesting detail to bring up. And speaking of Ocarina of Time, Breath of the Wild's map seems to be very similar to the former. The Gerudo Desert is on the left, and both Death Mountain and Zora's Domain are on the right. While the Lost Woods isn't directly south to the castle, it still is the second lowest area. But of course, the one thing that doesn't make sense is Lake Hylia. But don't worry, more on that later. Also, he believes that somehow due to Sheikah technology, they were able to swap places. Now, as he points out, there are some questions that need to be answered in order for this to be a possibility. How could the two locations be swapped, and why? So with that, it was time for me to start looking into these two locations and figure out whether this theory held ground. Unlike the Great Plateau, that is. Get it? Because it somehow moved between game. Yeah, that was a bad joke. Now, for those who didn't unsubscribe due to my terrible sense of humor, I thought that instead of looking at the how and why of this theory, I would go back and try to find more connections between the two locations. And I have to say, I was pretty surprised at what I found. Now, since these two locations may have swapped, I think we should take a look at where their original locations would be prior to the swap, meaning we would have to go all the way back to Ocarina of Time. So the first question is, where would the Great Plateau be located here? Well, it is very likely that Castletown and the Old Hyrule Castle are the same location as the Plateau in Breath of the Wild. This is due to both areas having the Temple of Time, as well as very similar structures from Castletown being on the plateau, such as buildings and the main fountain. The old man also talks about how the plateau was the birthplace of the Kingdom of Hyrule. This would make complete sense since this would have been the original location for Hyrule Castle and the town surrounding it. There is plenty of other information regarding this, however, instead of explaining it, Zeltic has a full video discussing the similarities between the Great Plateau and Ocarina of Time's Castletown, so I highly recommend taking a look at it. With that out of the way, it is now time to compare the Great Plateau to the Lost Woods in order to hopefully get some sort of connection. Starting off, like the Arch Noble stated, both regions are very similar in shape and size. Both areas also at one time would have held the Master Sword. First of all, there is the Temple of Time on the Great Plateau, which, if we remember from Ocarina of Time, was the original location of the Master Sword. Then in the Lost Woods, we can find the Master Sword in the Korok Forest right by the Great Deku Tree. Also, if we look at Mekar Island, which is just outside of the forest, it has a location that is somewhat similar to that of the Lone Islands leading to the Gerudo region. Both areas also seem to be elevated quite a bit off the ground and are surrounded by wall-like structures. But I believe the biggest clue to this theory lies in the shrines. Both the Great Plateau and Lost Woods have 4 shrines each. That in itself could be a coincidence. But if we go back to our conversation with the old man once we get all 4 spirit orbs, He tells us to meet him where the imaginary shrine lines intersect. Of course, he is referring to the Temple of Time, but I always thought it was strange. Why not just say the Temple of Time? And then I thought of doing something. While the placement of the shrines isn't the exact same as the Great Plateaus, I made 2 lines in order to find out where the intersection point would be, and it was the Korok Forest. In other words, the location of the Master Sword. And if we go back to the Great Plateau, as you see, the intersection point is indeed the Temple of Time. In other words, the original Master Sword location. Still not convinced? Well, I looked at the Great Plateau and found a forest within it, and it is referred to as the Forest of Spirits. And as we know from Zelda lore, Koroks are the transformed forms of Kokiri that are referred to as spirits. Forest spirits, you could say? So do I think that the 2 locations were swapped? Well, if you think I don't, then you must have not been paying attention. But the thing is, not only do I believe this, but it also makes a lot of sense. First of all, if we swap the 2 locations in Breath of the Wild, then the Great Plateau's Castletown would be exactly where it needed to be in order to make sense. And now to address Lake Hylia. I left off saying that the placement of this was the only problem with Breath of the Wild and Ocarina of Time's maps being the same. If Castletown is here, then how is Lake Hylia right beside the Great Plateau's Castletown? Well, the answer is as easy as swapping Castletown and the Lost Woods just like it was for Breath of the Wild. Now Castletown is shown to be pretty close to Lake Hylia, just like the Great Plateau is in Breath of the Wild. Now, since I've proven that these places were indeed swapped, it is now time to get into the how and why. Starting with the former, there are a few possible explanations for it. Since I played Twilight Princess, the first thing I thought of was Twilight magic. If you recall, there is a section of the game where a chunk of the Bridge of Eldin is warped to the Gerudo Desert. Now imagine this, but a little more powerful, and you got yourselves a region swap. However, there are some obvious problems with this. First of all, this type of thing has only been done on small objects, such as bridge pieces. It's hard to imagine a whole region being transported this way. Also, this would be assuming that the game falls in the child timeline along with Twilight Princess. And even though I brought up the possibility of Twilight Princess taking place in multiple timelines in a previous video, I still think it is unlikely that Twilight magic was used. The second possibility would be Sheikah technology, which very well could be the case. I mean, they managed to build the Divine Beasts, shrines, as well as the 5 storage units for the Guardians resembling giant pillars that were kept very far underground. So the possibility of them being able to move something as big as the Great Plateau could happen. But I think the answer is much simpler than that. You see, if we go back to Skyward Sword's story, we can find out that when Demise and his army of demons attacked, the goddess Hylia brought all the humans together and raised parts of the earth skyward to protect them, as well as the Triforce. A kid from the Woodland Stable even references Skyward Sword. While Sheikah may be unable to move a giant landmass, a goddess would have no problem doing so. So finally, we are left with one question. Why do this? Well, from looking at the obvious reason, it must have been to hide a Master Sword. Instead of moving the Master Sword to the Lost Woods, they moved the entire Lost Woods to where the Master Sword is and placed Castletown in that now empty spot, soon becoming the Great Plateau. This way, even though the sword is in the same location, it would be hard to get to it since one would need to get through the Lost Woods. As we see from NPCs, they do know that the Master Sword is hidden deep in a forest and even talk about how it is close to the Woodland Stable. But since no one can get through, the sword stays safely hidden. Some even talk about rumors referring to something dangerous in the Lost Woods. Perhaps this rumor was created in order to prevent people from entering the Lost Woods? Now, since the swap was most likely to hide the Master Sword, the question now is, why hide it? The first obvious answer to that would be so no one bad gets their hands on it, but since the whole sword is based on repelling evil, I doubt any evil entity would be trying to find it. But then comes the next possibility. In order to protect people from dying, by spreading scary stories about the Lost Woods, it would stop people from trying to enter it. Also, even if they did get to the Master Sword, they would die trying to pull it out since the blade chooses its wielder, as well as the fact that 13 hearts are required to successfully get it. So most likely the swap was done in order to protect people from any harm. And that's it, honestly. I've made some very solid connections between the 2 areas, explained how the swap would have made sense, as well as how and why they would do it. As far as I'm concerned, after months of YouTubers theorizing this, the mystery of the Great Plateau has finally been solved. Now, there are a few other things I want to quickly address before I end off the video. I just didn't know where to put these. We were looking at where the entrance could have been for the Great Plateau before it was swapped, and came up with a few ideas. If we simply overlay the Great Plateau onto the Great Hyrule Forest, then the entrance could be around here since there is no wall surrounding this part of the plateau. However, the Archnoble had an idea regarding this that makes a lot more sense. If you don't know, there is a main gate for the plateau located right here with steps going up. However, due to the debris blocking the entrance, water filled up the section and is now a small pond. His route circles the border of the plateau and ends in the same section. And you might say that this is impossible since there is a moat of water around the Hyrule Forest. But this body of water isn't actually connected to the ocean. Therefore, it is very likely that this was once dry land. It's just that over time, the rainfall filled the moat up with water. And the last thing to talk about. Before you get the paraglider, there is a fog that prevents the player from leaving the plateau. Instead of Link dying, could this have just acted like the Lost Woods fog and teleport him back to the plateau? Is the fog from the Enchanted Woods and the Great Plateau similar? But then, why does it disappear once you get the paraglider? If the two locations were swapped, it might make sense that the remnants of the fog would linger since the Great Plateau was the original location of the Lost Woods. Besides that, I'd like to give a huge shout out to both the Arch Noble for bringing this theory to my attention, as well as Laurelian Historian for helping theorize with me for the specific Breath of the Wild theory. And if you want to suggest an interesting theory, then make sure to join my Discord server. Link is in the description. And if you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel. We have a small ways to go until 10,000 subs, and I appreciate the continued support from each and every one of you. I've been Nintendo Crisis, and I'll see you guys later.